Hello everyone and welcome to CRTV 131, Contemporary American Cinema, Class 1. That's a mouthful. This is our very first class, and this resembles the exact class that I would present in the classroom, in person. I would give a PowerPoint slide lecture, just like this. Lots of pictures, okay, not just text, lots of pictures. And I would talk through it. I would talk about a director or a concept for a little while with PowerPoint slides, and then I would put on a DVD. Yes, I still have old school DVDs. I would put on DVD from my personal collection, or I would link to some scenes from YouTube, and then I'd go back to PowerPoint slides. So that's normally the way my class would be. Our class would be. And so it's up to you to make it like that. The lecture is done, recorded by me weeks before the class, but the lecture is the same lecture, but I don't go back and forth. So I'm not going to take the trouble, I'm sorry, I'm not going to take the time and the trouble to lecture for a little bit and then link to a clip and then lecture for a little bit. It seems like a little bit too much. And these recorded lectures live on YouTube, and it just didn't seem very practical to do it that way. So for you in Canvas, can do that quite easily. You can just pause the lecture part, the PowerPoint lecture part, and click on one of the next module points and watch the film, and then go back to the lecture. It's actually pretty easy. You don't have to do that. You are in charge. You are in control, and that is the best part, I think, about this. I miss seeing you all in person, that's for sure. I get a lot of energy from a class full of students, but just seeing these PowerPoint slides, it does get me up and ready to go. So you are in, as I said, you are in charge. You can stop if I'm talking too fast and write notes and then go forward. You can't do that in the classroom. And if I go to the next slide before you're ready in the classroom, then you can always come up and get the slides and the notes during the break or something like that. But with this online version, you can stop and go back a little. I was going to say rewind, but you can stop and you can go back and listen to it again and copy down the text and all that, or take a break, take a bathroom break, take a meal break, or anything like that. So you are in charge and you are in control. And otherwise, it should resemble, if you just close your eyes, it should resemble exactly what you'd be getting in the classroom. And I have had many students who have had me in the classroom and have had this online version, and they all say it's actually a very smooth transition to online teaching, since it resembles the classroom so closely. Okay, so with all that said, this very first lecture is going to catch us up to where we are in history, because there has been a lot of film history from the beginning of American cinema, somewhere around 1895, up to where contemporary American cinema is going to begin, and that's somewhere in the 60s. Okay, so we're about 60, 70 years in, somewhere in the 60s, what they call the new Hollywood. And so I'm going to be referring to lots of stuff, or I would be referring to lots of stuff like the fall of the studio system and the fall of the studio system and all of that. And you probably wouldn't really know what I'm talking about, because you didn't, quite possibly didn't have the first part of this class, CRTV 121. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend this class only encapsulating and condensing the entire 15-week class, not the entire 15-week class, but all the important points in the first semester, so that I'm not referring to things first person, this and that, and studio system and production code and all that kind of stuff. So that's what I'm going to do today. And so we're not going to have any videos today. And this is the only class where we won't have any videos or any clips. Here in Canvas, I will be linking to lots and lots of clips that I would have shown in class. And not exactly the same ones. With my DVD, I can start a little earlier and go a little longer and that sort of thing. But YouTube's pretty good, and they have all these famous movies. These are all very famous movies. The Graduate in 2001 and all that kind of stuff, even all the way up to Parasite and recent films. YouTube has all that stuff, and it is fantastic. But it's not exactly what I would have done in class, but it's pretty darn close. But for this first class, sadly, it's going to be all lecture and no links to any videos. But starting with class 2, there will be a dozen or more links for every class. And I'm calling them class rather than week because I'm going to open them up, all the classes before each test. So before test 1, I think we do class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to just open up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 all at once, starting on the first week of class, and you can do that at your own speed. Okay, self-study, I guess they call it. You can watch them 1 week at a time if you want, just like in the classroom, or you can binge or whatever you want to do. But I will open or release, I'm not sure what they call it in Canvas, but I will have all those 5 classes and those 5 PowerPoint slide lectures and all that released all at once. So it's not really week 1, week 2, or anything like that. Okay, so anyway, that's how I'm going to do the class. There I am I'm in a mall, South Coast Plaza, I think. Nice picture my wife took. And let's dive into our brief, condensed overview of American cinema from 1895 to 1965 and some of the important points. So this overview of this class, we're going to have 3 points that we're going to talk about. Normally they talk about a 3-legged stool, but since this is a film class, we're going to talk about a tripod. We're going to talk about technology. And so we have to develop film and cameras and all that. And then later on, they're going to have to develop sound. And after that, color and widescreens and all that. So that's the technology. And then when we get to contemporary American cinema, toward the end, I'm going to have a full class on CGI, computer-generated imagery, and really talk about the technology and where it is today, green screen, and all that kind of stuff. So that's a technology. That's going to be there in the background for the most part. The business is going to be pretty close, not exactly front and center, but the business is a big part of this class, and it is a business and how movies are distributed and shown and all that. And that really determines what kinds of movies get made. Okay, we have lots of superhero movies because it is good for business, first and foremost. It might be good for art and it might be good for stories and all the whole rest of it, but if it's not good for business, then those kinds of movies and their huge budgets, their $200 and $250 million budgets, wouldn't get green lit. So business is there too. And I have to say, as a side point, that even if you are not a film major or CRTV major, a media major, this is a good class to take. Even if you're a business major, there are good, or other majors, frankly, for that matter, there are good career paths on the business side of the entertainment industry. So whether it's television or film, there are lots of jobs for people that are organized and can do budgeting and can do scheduling and can work for producers. And instead of unloading trucks and things like that with equipment, you walk around with a tablet and tell people where to put things and so on. So it is a good career path. Okay, the entertainment industry in general and film and TV in particular, it is a good career path for business majors. So think about that. And then there's the art side, and that is the traditional camera and lighting and directing and acting and all of that, and that's also a good career path. And some of you might be taking our production classes and things like that, and that's fantastic too. Okay, so a couple of different career paths, and we're going to talk about all that. And that, to me, I have to say, that's my favorite part, talking about how Stanley Kubrick put together 2001, and Wes Anderson and his symmetry and things like that. So that's a fun part too. So where did movies come from? Right. Well, Edward Muybridge took pictures of a horse in action to settle a bet. Okay, now I've left those because the bet was, does a horse at full gallop ever have all four of its legs off the ground at the same time? Okay, ask yourself. Okay, the answer is in that slide. Okay, don't go back. I will in just a second. And so what Muybridge did was he got maybe 20 cameras, and he put them along a track, and he put string or wire or something like that across the track, and as the horse galloped by at full gallop, they would trip the wires and take a picture. So the first was done with a whole bunch of cameras, and here is the result. And as we see right off, even in picture 2 and 3, yes, a horse at full gallop does have all four of its legs off the ground at the same time. Okay, but a lot of times it doesn't. And so if you were to cut these individual pictures and flip them, it would look like a horse in motion. And we all know those flip books and things like that. And that got lots of people thinking that if we could take photos fast enough, that we could have the image of, or the illusion of, motion pictures, right? Moving pictures, right? Or movies. Yeah, that's where it came from. Pictures that moved are movies. Pictures that talk are talkies, and so on. So there are three parts of motion pictures. There is the film and the camera and the projector. They're all three different inventions and technologies. George Eastman and his staff came up with film, celluloid film, and they put chemicals on the film. It's a photochemical process. The light, photons, I guess, from the light come in. I think photos or something is a Latin word or Greek word, something like that, meaning light. Anyway, it's going to, the celluloid is coated in chemicals. Okay, so there's celluloid and there's the chemicals that are sitting on top of that celluloid. And a lens is going to focus all that stuff onto an image. And the camera is going to record all of that, all of those images. So film was new to photography. Photography, capturing still pictures, has been around since 1830. Okay, quite a while ago, 1830, before the Civil War. But it was pieces of tin type, linotype, stuff like that. And you could only take them one at a time, and it was a big deal, and there was a big drape that went over the photographer's head, and all that kind of stuff. And that's how they got pictures of Abraham Lincoln, and how they got pictures of the stuff during the Civil War in the 1860s and all of that. So film, in the 1880s, Kodak, or Eastman, Eastman Kodak, they became one company at a certain point. They figured out how to do the film, and a few years later, Edison and his people said, can you give us 50 feet or so of that stuff? And they did, and they figured out a way to put it in a camera so that each a picture was done one at a time. It's not continuous. It's not like audio tape or something like that. It's not continuous. So the film has to stop and pause very briefly. A shutter has to let the light in, and then the shutter has to close, and then the film has to advance to the next spot, and then it needs to get exposed again. So it's kind of complicated. Like I say, it's not continuous like audio tape or anything like that. But the Edison people figured that out, built the camera, hand crank, right? So it's no motors or anything like that. It's hand cranked, I think it's like 10 feet a second, something like that. I'm not sure. This one would be for panning, and this would probably be for tilting. And this is, I don't know that it's an original Edison camera, but it's a pretty old camera there, and you can go, you can grab it, and off you go. And then with Edison's short little moving pictures, people would watch them in a sort of like a box. They'd put their eyes up to the viewfinder and put a nickel in, and they would crank it, and they could watch a movie solo. Okay, so that was called a peep show, and that's what Edison and his people did. I think it's the Vitascope. Don't worry about that. But the French, the Lumiere brothers, thought that telling stories in front of an audience was really a better way to do it. And really, when you think about it, there have been actors performing in front of crowds going back to the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, 2,500 years ago, and probably even longer ago than that. And there were magic lanterns and things like that with sort of like slide projectors and so on, way back in the 1700s, where people would watch a whole story in a theater. So the whole idea of and plus theater, just regular old theater, actors on stage. So it really seemed to make a lot of sense to certainly the Lumiere brothers and a lot of other people, that these moving pictures would be better in front of an audience rather than one by one. So by the time all this came together, it was 1895, and that's when motion pictures were invented. If we're looking for a decade, and we probably will for testing purposes, it will be the 1890s. Okay, that's how old motion pictures are, and that's all the part of the technology. It's changed a lot. Actually, it hasn't really changed that much now. Of course, we're digital, but basically film and projectors, they're still around. There are still directors that want to shoot on film, they insist on film. Christopher Nolan, he's going to shoot on film until his dying day, and there are other directors as well. It's a very small part of the business these days. Very small part, 10% or so of the business is still with film in cameras, but it's the same thing from 125 years ago. Basically, it's the same technology, 125 years. And that means it's a good technology, and it's good for archiving and all of that. Okay, so they are making these moving pictures in New York, and that's where their first audience is, New York and New Jersey, and that's where people are paying for these early filmmakers. But New York and New Jersey, they have pretty harsh winters, and snow and sleet, and the days are very short, and rain, and all that kind of stuff. It's not a good place to make movies in the winter months, and movies by 1903, 4, 5 were quite popular, and they really needed to get product into the theaters, tiny little theaters and stuff. They weren't very much yet, but they still needed new product every week, right? If you are running a business, the last thing you want to do is to run out of product. Think about trying to get that new pair of sneakers. Think about trying to get that new iPhone, and they're all sold out, and it's kind of frustrating. And you might come back next week, but you don't want to come back next month. You might say to yourself, I'll just find something else, right? I really wanted that, and they don't have it, and they're going to be out of it for a while. So I'll maybe find a different product. And so the early filmmakers figured that out and figured they better start cranking this stuff out, at least a movie a week, if not faster. So they moved to California, took the train out. They would have taken the train out, some cameras, some tripods, shoot on the streets of Southern California. They were kind of all spread out for a little while, from San Diego to San Francisco. But it ended up in the Los Angeles area, and they would initially rent apartments and shoot on the streets or out in the hills, but eventually they bought property. They put up buildings and things, sets, and stages. Eventually they would put up stages for interior shooting. And that would take them a few years. Like I say, at the first winter or two, they just shot on the streets and so on, and got those films, put them on the train, and took them back to New York and so on. But it didn't take long for them to relocate. We get the rise of the movie star, Charlie Chaplin, and you probably know Charlie Chaplin, and that really says a lot. That really says a lot. He was the most famous person on Earth, very likely, the most famous living person on Earth, very likely by 1920 or so. And there are lots of movie stars that were very big movie stars, every bit as big as Leonardo DiCaprio or Brad Pitt or one of the four holy Chris's, Chris Pine, Chris Hemsworth, Chris Pratt, oh my goodness, Pine, Pratt, Hemsworth, Evans. Okay, one of the four Chris's, and they were big stars, right? Humphrey Bogart, a very big star. Clark Gable, a very big star, every bit as big as those. And you probably don't know them, right? You probably don't know them. They were big stars and you probably don't know them. And it's not how little you know or how ignorant you are. It is more about how fame is fleeting. That's what it's about. It's about fame is fleeting. And it's also about how famous Chaplin was, because you know Chaplin 100 years later. And there aren't very many other movie stars that most people know after 20 or 30 years. Even movie stars from the 1960s are quite forgotten in many instances. So that's how big a star Chaplin was, that we still know him 100 years later. Like Marilyn Monroe, okay, from the 50s, and maybe James Dean and a few other stars, but there are lots of big movie stars between Chaplin and DiCaprio that are lost in the mists of time. Okay, anyway, that's when that started. Charlie Chaplin, way back just 15, 20 years into the business. The studio system in the 1920s arises. It's like a factory assembly line. Basically, it is mass production. It's mass production. It is cheaper to make movies as fast as you can, save the props, save the costumes, save the sets, save all that stuff, use it again, okay, and the actors and all that, save everything, and build permanent sets like those streets, like that Western street and so on, and hire enough people to keep a bunch of scripts coming out. And if you make 4 movies at a time, 4 movies at a time on separate lots, maybe a Western and so on, and it takes you a month to make each movie, then you will make an average of 1 per week, right? So that's 50 movies per year, and that's what they were doing. They were making 50 or 60 movies per year by making them 4 or 5 or 6 at a time over the period of 4 or 5 or 6 weeks. And they could crank them out and get that product out into the theaters. People are going to the movies twice a week, right? There's no TV, no radio. There's professional sports and a few other things. But what else are you going to do? They really had the entertainment dollar. There's vaudeville. There's maybe a little bit of theater, a little bit of music halls and things. But otherwise, the movies, they had a good 25 years before radio came out. And also importantly, the industry was founded by immigrants. They were founded by immigrants who were minorities. Okay, they were a minority, and we are a nation of immigrants. And the lot of a minority is always a tough one. It's hard, whether it is a religious minority or whether it is a racial minority. It's a tough go. It's a tough go. I don't need to say a whole lot about that. And so for Jewish immigrants, mostly coming from Eastern Europe, Poland and Russia and places like that, and we had waves and waves of immigrants, starting with the original, with the English, and then here come the Scottish and the French and the Germans and so on, and the Irish and the potato famine, and then at the turn of the last century, more from Eastern Europe, Italy, places like that, darker skinned peoples, okay, not Protestants, okay, not Protestants and so on. Even Catholics, right? Catholics were a minority, and they were marginalized too, right? Irish and Italian Catholics were also marginalized, believe it or not. But these were mostly Jewish immigrants, and they could not work in established industries like banking and so on Wall Street. So if it is a new industry, usually there isn't an old guard there keeping everyone out. Okay, so they could get into this very new industry, motion picture industry. Today we have the internet and things like that. That's relatively new. So any new industry or new technology, it's a good way to break in. Otherwise, things can get a little bit ossified, and people can sort of keep the door halfway shut. So they formed the 6 big studios and a whole bunch of little studios. Most of them are still around in one form or another. MGM was the biggest studio in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and now they are not much to speak of. They have some stuff in Las Vegas and so on, and they still have their name on the James Bond films, but they were the biggest, and now they're probably the smallest. Notice Disney's not even on here. Disney, Walt didn't even start making cartoons till the 1920s, and Disney was not much of anything until the 1980s and 1990s when they became the big Disney company. They were just putting out the cartoons, Snow White, Mary Poppins, stuff like that. Theme park in the 1950s, but Disney really didn't become Disney till much later. Paramount, part of CBS. Fox just got gobbled up by Disney. Warner Brothers is still Warner Brothers for the most part. RKO has sort of changed its name, and they're kind of sort of around, and Universal is there with NBC. So they are kind of around, but now they're big, giant, multinational conglomerates rather than just family-owned and family-run studios. Here's a business term, vertical integration, and that is the production and distribution and exhibition. So the same people that are making the product are distributing and selling the product. Now, that's not normally the way things are, and that's not normally the way the courts like things to be. So if we think about the automobile industry, Ford does not sell the trucks. Ford dealers sell trucks, and they are different businesses. Now, there's licensing and all that, but it's a different business. So if you go to Detroit and knock on the door and say, I want one of those brand new F-150 pickup trucks, they're going to say, sorry, we don't sell them here. Okay. Now, generally, it is discouraged. I know there are Apple stores and things like that, but for the most part, who makes the product doesn't sell the product. Usually it's sold through stores and chains and things like that. That's vertical integration. I mention that because that is going to be part of the downfall of the studio system in the late 1940s. These early actors are under long-term contracts. It's rather paternalistic. The actors are treated, sort of like children. You're a cowboy star, John Wayne, and you're going to make cowboy movies, and you're going to stay away from dramas, and you're going to stay away from this. And Fred Astaire, you're going to make musicals, and you're not going to make dramas and things like that. There's a fair amount of typecasting. They are under contract for 5 and 7 years, and some of them are going to be happy with the paychecks, but want a little bit more say in how their career is going, maybe think of themselves as artists and so on. Now, this whole idea about contracts and paternalistic treatment, this is the same thing that's going on in sports. This is the same thing that's going on in music. Okay, we have talented people in sports. We have talented people recording, and they sometimes when you're young and you're 19 and maybe you don't have a lawyer or something like that, you can get taken advantage of by a company that is waving some nice big contract in your face. So this is still around. That's why I bring it up. This is still around, contracts and paternalism and that sort of thing. So jumping all the way up to the late 1920s, this is when sound comes in. So if you see a movie and it's got sync sound, people talking, that means it came out from 1927 onward. And if you see a movie, it might be black and white and all the whole rest of it, and there's no talking, but there are intertitles, which would be a black screen with just the words on it. They didn't put them at the bottom. Those are subtitles, and they weren't doing that. They weren't doing subtitles. They were doing intertitles. But this is the first one that actually has lips moving and words coming out and all of that. Okay, it was a big hit. It looks kind of old and kind of clunky today. Matter of fact, it's a very odd movie because only the singing was synced. The talking still had intertitles on it, except for one scene where he's playing the piano for his mother and talking to her, sort of off script. So it's a very odd movie, but it's a huge, huge success. And this is important. Within about 3 years, virtually all American movies were talkies. So that's pretty fast, about 3 years. Okay, and that's going to be different than color, another technology. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But sound, from 1927 by 1930, virtually all movies are sync sound. Production code comes in the early 1930s, 1934. So movies that came out from the beginning of sound in 1927 to 1934 are called pre-code. And they might be movies like Tarzan and his Mate, showing a fair amount of skin. Some movies with gangsters, like Scarface, would have a fair amount of violence. Sometimes they would have drugs and things. Sometimes it would just be situations like the boss inviting his secretary into his office and then closing the door. Okay, the audience kind of knows what's going on. So there was lots of stuff going on that was troublesome for a lot of people. And churches in particular were railing against all of that. So they censored themselves. This is important, self-censorship. And that's what we are under still today. That's why I bring this up. It's not old 1934 stuff. It's with us still today in the 2020s, censorship. And today, of course, we have the rating system, and it is age-based, but it is still self-censorship. So that hasn't gone away, and that began way back in the 1930s. For the art side, Hollywood's greatest year, 1939, a real peak. We have Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz, and a bunch of other movies you don't know, like Gunga Din and Ninotchka and Destiny Rides Again and Dark Victory and movies like that. But even in 1939, they recognized it as being a pretty significant year. And so we will remember that because we are going to talk, and the era sort of around the 1930s, 1937 to 1944, a lot of really great movies came out. Citizen Kane, movies like that, Casablanca, Grapes of Wrath. So many great movies came out in that era. It really is a golden era. And we are going to highlight the second golden era. The second golden era being the late 60s, from The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde and Easy Rider and 2001 up through the early 1970s with The Godfather and The Exorcist and Jaws and Chinatown and all of that. So we are going to deal with the second golden age. So you got to know when the first golden age was, and so that we can talk about the second golden age. And that brings up a really good question from 1941, Citizen Kane. How do we know greatness? And I could put in the arts. Now, if this is the Olympics and somebody's running the 100-meter dash, that we have stopwatches and things, right? And height and pole vault and all that. But also with the Olympics, we have judging. Okay, figure skating, snowboarding, gymnastics, all of those are judged. They aren't measured, they're judged. And for most of us, if they don't fall on their butt, then it looks pretty good. But experts are going to see things that the rest of us aren't going to see. And that's the way it is for the arts as well, for literature and theater and music. Okay, why is Beethoven Beethoven, and Picasso is Picasso, and Rembrandt, and all of that, right? And that's because the experts have told us, and all of those experts together have formed a consensus. So that will be our shortcut there, consensus. Okay, and second part, right? Citizen Kane came out in 1941. We need, does it stand the test of time? And in Citizen Kane's case, yeah, it does pretty well. Some movies that were very highly regarded, like Gone with the Wind, hasn't really stood the test of time quite so well. It's still up there and it's still highly regarded, but the way African Americans are treated in the movie, and women, and so on. It's not quite. I mean, you know, there was slavery and all that, but just the way it is dealt with in the movie, it hasn't quite stood the test of time the way, say, Casablanca has, that only came out a year or two later, or Citizen Kane for that matter, 1941. So standing the test of time, and we're going to shorten that to perspective. Okay, looking at the big picture. And so the movies that we're going to talk about in this class, all those ones that I've already named, like Bonnie and Clyde in 2001, and The Godfather and all that, I think have been great, right? Consensus and perspective. Yes, check and check. So Citizen Kane gets the honor often, not always, not 100% of the time, it gets the honor of being known as the greatest film of all time. And here we have a wonderful bit of lighting, and just one of the ways that it is thought to be a great film, with its deep focus, sharp focus from here to here to here. Okay, it wasn't very easy to do in 1941. It wasn't very easy to do. The camera, the technology, lenses, all that kind of stuff. It was pretty hard to do that, line it up like that so brilliantly and wonderfully, and so on. So that's the deep focus, but there's lots of it. It's nonlinear, right? They tell the story from 6 different viewpoints. Okay, we only get to nonlinear stuff much more recently with movies like Pulp Fiction. Okay, and this was a nonlinear film way back in 1941. Color. Okay, I believe this is in your syllabus. You can scroll through there somewhere in Canvas. And I have students that have asked me over the years, when did movies start being in color? And I thought I'd better do some research and get a better handle on it. And movies have always been in color. Okay, now this is hand colored, frame by frame. So that's not exactly what most people are thinking of. And so this would have been a 35 millimeter piece of film. 35 millimeters is only about 2.5 inches. Okay, so this whole thing, squeeze it down to 2.5 inches, right? About as big as this thing is. And then color it in frame by frame. Back then, maybe 16 or 18 frames per second. They settled on 24, but back then it was a little less than that without sound. Sound didn't work quite as well unless it was standardized at 24 frames per second, FPS, you might see. And they have sort of converted 24 frames per second even into the digital world. So even though most cameras are shooting digital, it still translates to somewhere 24, and television at 30 scans or frames per second. So color, almost always. In the 1920s, the bath process, now this technically it's color, but the whole scene would be blue. Often night would be blue. Jungle would be green. Desert scenes would be yellow. And sometimes sepia, which is sort of this golden brownish sort of a thing, or just regular old grayscale. Not exactly black and white, but technically it's grayscale. So yeah, most movies, 80% of movies had color in the 1920s. But again, not exactly what people are thinking of when they're asking when did color movies come out. Also in the 1920s, a 2-strip process comes along. It's not bad. Blue and red, I think they didn't have green or something. I'm not sure, but they didn't quite have that. But finally, in the early 1930s, a full 3-strip color process comes out. This is from Gone with the Wind, and it looks wonderful, Technicolor. It really looks wonderful, but audiences and studios weren't really clamoring for it. They weren't really clamoring. You'd think, oh my God, this is color. But it really wasn't. People weren't really clamoring for it. First off, these cameras are gigantic. There are 3 strips of film in there. There's a prism and everything. It is a lot of technology. It's a big deal moving this thing around, right? This, I don't know, 2 tons. I don't think it's 2 tons, but it's a big thing here. Okay. And then you got to think about, they had to think about makeup, they had to think about costumes and sets, and the costume and the sets had to be coordinated, and so on, right? And color, all that. It's even red. If you think about red, good old lipstick, blood red. Um, what it looks like to the eye and what it looks like on film are often two different things. Actual, real human blood tends to photograph very, very dark, almost maroon, almost black. So fake movie blood is closer to kind of like an orange. And it photographs, and when you see it, it looks more like candy apple red or fire engine red or something like that, which is what people expect blood to look like. Not, I don't mean to gross you out, but red was tough. So frame by frame, bath process, Technicolor, and look at that, from 32, 33, 34 to 68, it's 30 plus years for virtually 100% of films to be in color. Sound, again, sound is 3 years, color is about 35 years. Okay, so people, they liked it. Like I said, it was more expensive and more troublesome. Big studios that could afford it, like MGM, tended to emphasize musicals. Musicals are bright and happy and singing and all that, so Singing in the Rain and American in Paris and movies like that were in color. And Walt Disney loved color, so animated films, Snow White and so on, Fantasia, all that, Pinocchio, they were also in color. But lots and lots of movies were not in color, and the audiences didn't seem to mind too much. Now, the audiences could have voted with their pocketbook. If they just quit going to see black and white movies, everybody would have converted, right? That's how you vote. You vote with your pocketbook. And if we think about it, we are all voting today, and we are voting on 3D. And everybody today is voting, who cares, on 3D, right? 3D's been around for 10 years. Why aren't all films in 3D? Because a lot of us are voting, we don't care. We'd rather save a couple of bucks and see it. Maybe we don't like the technology, maybe it gives us headaches, maybe we don't like the glasses, but we are all voting on 3D. And Avatar came out 10 years ago, 11, right? And it's still not the majority. It's converted. A lot of times it's not done with 3D cameras. We'll talk about that all when we get closer and closer to the future. But before you start thinking, oh my God, how could they watch all of those black and white movies back then? I've never seen a black and white movie in my life, and I don't like black and white, and it's boring, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, think about 3D, and think about when you're 50 years old. Some kids asks you, hey, Pops, how come you saw all those flat screen movies? Wasn't that boring? No, we didn't care. We got to see Avengers, Endgame, and all those wonderful movies, and they were 2D, and we didn't care. Okay, so some people are going to look at you kind of funny when you're as old as I am, and wondering how you could have watched all those movies in 2D, just like we look back and ask our parents and grandparents, how could they watch all those black and white movies? Next up, we have double features. During the Depression, certainly they wanted to have movies to be a pretty good deal, like a bargain, 2 for the price of 1. So the double features would have the A movie and the B movie, and very quickly, B movies in particular took on that unintended, cheapo, not so good, schlocky sort of a thing, right? The A movie had the big stars and all that kind of stuff, and the B movie was lower budget, not big famous stars, and all the whole rest of it. Now there's lots of hidden gems out there. Gun Crazy is a fantastic film noir, really one of the best. I love it. Kind of a Bonnie and Clyde thing. But it was a B movie, and a lot of people, they eventually started calling movies B movies. Even today, people talk about B movies. Today, or before today, B movies kind of morphed into drive-in movies for a while. And they say, oh, it's just a drive-in movie. And this is going to be important for us because a number of movies that are important in our class, like Bonnie and Clyde and Easy Rider are going to be thought of as drive-in movies, and are going to be dumped in the drive-in the summer when maybe people aren't so serious, and there's kids and teenagers in the backseat making out and all that kind of stuff and talking, and serious movies that are shown in theaters and all that. So this is going to be an important thing for us in just a couple of classes when we start talking about the new Hollywood with Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate and so on being called drive-in movies. Auteur theory, it's just the French word for author, basically. And most movies in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s were done with a studio look to it, right? MGM movies looked a certain way. Paramount movies looked a little bit different. And Warner Brothers movies were different still. Okay, it almost didn't matter who was the director. It looked like a Warner Brothers movie. But over time, some critics, especially French, started saying, well, those Busby Berkeley movies and those Alfred Hitchcock movies and those John Ford movies and those Frank Capra movies are different, right? Alfred Hitchcock could make a movie for anyone, and it would be a Hitchcock movie, not a Warner Brothers movie or an RKO movie. And so could Tarantino, for that matter, right? So that is where the director exerts their personal style and control and vision, really over the studio. And Quentin Tarantino very definitely is an auteur, and most of the directors in this class, whether it's Spielberg or Wes Anderson or the Coen brothers or Christopher Nolan, are auteurs. So this is very important for our class, auteurs. We're also going to talk about what we learned in English class way back in high school, third person, he, she, they. Most movies are like that. The camera is telling the story, and the camera can go anywhere. So if we are looking at Avengers, our camera can go from one Avenger to another, to the bad guys, to the good guys, out to the planets, back to Earth. It can travel everywhere. Okay, sort of a bird's eye view or God's eye view. Okay, and if you've got a big sprawling story like an Avengers movie or a Lord of the Rings movie, that's probably the best way to go. But there are lots of excellent movies told in the first person, I. And we're going to concentrate on that. We're going to talk about that, whether it's Fight Club or Clockwork Orange. These movies are different, and we're going to see the movie through one person's viewpoint. And sometimes often they're going to talk to us. Right? We're going to hear their thoughts. And that's a big deal. It's a big deal to hear their thoughts. Okay. Otherwise, we don't really know. We have no idea what Luke Skywalker is thinking. We know what he's doing, but we don't know what he's thinking. Or Vito Corleone, right? We don't know what they're thinking. Sometimes people do one thing and think another. And so this interior monologue, hearing their thoughts, is really pretty important. It's really pretty important. A lot of movies don't do it because we can't go jumping around the universe or jumping around Middle Earth if we are in the first person. So it has its drawbacks, but it has a big advantage that we are going to hear their thoughts. So when we talk about movies, we're going to talk about first person. And when they come up, like Forrest Gump here, we're going to take note of it because that makes it a bit unusual. I don't have a number on how many % of movies are told in the first person, but I got to think that it's 10% or less, which makes them unusual. Anything that's unusual, maybe it's told out of order, non-linear, first person, breaking the fourth wall, all that stuff. Anything that's out of the ordinary, we're going to call attention to it. Well, we also have to watch out for the unreliable narrator. There's Forrest Gump, and he has a low IQ, lower than average IQ, and we're going to be in on the joke. He's going to talk about his friend taking his money and investing in a fruit company, and that fruit company is Apple. Okay, and we're going to laugh because we're in on the joke, and he's going to get rich off of his investment in this fruit company. Okay, so unreliable narrators, sometimes for humor, sometimes they're just going to mess with us, right? Sometimes they're just messing with us and the usual suspects or something like that, and we're going to be totally thrown off. Okay, some more general stuff. We're going to think about adjusting for inflation. Here we are at a hamburger joint, Henry's Hamburgers, and you can get a hamburger and French fries and a Coke for way under $1, like 50 cents. What, 15 and 25 and 35, 40 cents for a lunch. Okay, now that sounds like a pretty good deal, but back then, in the, say, 1940, 1950, a school teacher, which is a pretty good middle class job, okay, it's not a Wall Street person or anything like that, but it's a very good middle class job, would make $1,000 a year. Okay, $1,000 a year. Okay, doesn't sound like much, but you could buy a whole house for $3,000 or $4,000. You could buy a car for $500. Okay, so everything is scaled down. That's important. Everything's scaled down. You could get lunch for 50 cents, buy a car for $500, but you're only making $1,000 a year, right? $50 a week, $60 a week, something like that. Okay, so we're going to talk about adjusting for inflation, especially in the earlier going. We're not going to be talking about the 1940s so much, but even in the 1970s and 80s, prices are going to come around, and we're going to sort of laugh at how cheap that is, but we also have to remember how much money people were making. Genres are well established by the late 1960s, and that is a nice French word. There's lots of French words. In film noir we have film noir, right? Noir, that's a French word, noir for black. We have femme fatales, things like that. Genre, another French word, just a categorization. Musical, Western, horror, sci-fi, rom-com, romantic comedy, film noir. Here's Dracula's Castle, wonderful stuff from there. And so in genres in particular, we're going to get tropes. And tropes are these commonalities in genres. So in the horror trope, we get storms and castles and monsters and scientists playing God and creating life in a lab and fog and all that stuff, right? All that dramatic weather and things and labs and all that, right? Those are tropes, and different tropes for Westerns and different tropes for superhero movies or high school movies, okay? All sorts of different tropes. That's the term we're going to use. So, end of the 1940s and through the 1950s, we have the fall of the studio system. People still talk about the studio system today. This is not ancient history, and you might be thinking, what is this doing in contemporary American cinema? It is very much a part of contemporary American cinema, the studio system. So let's talk about how it fell, because this is a business thing, and maybe it helps us think about let's don't do that next time, right? Let's learn from our mistakes. So, first part, Paramount decision, independent theater owners. They weren't all part of chains. They were independent theaters, and they took the studios to court, and they said, we're getting a raw deal. We're getting your cast-off movies. We have to buy movies in a block rather than one by one, and a few other things that they didn't like about it. The courts ruled in their favor and against the studios, and the studios had to divest, sell off. They had to divest their theater chains. Now, they didn't have to give them away, okay? They didn't just take them, right? They had to sell them, and those movie theaters are in prime locations right downtown, right downtown, just like the Chinese theater, great big movie theaters all around the country. So they made a lot of money selling the theaters off, but they really didn't want to do that. They really didn't want to have to do that. And now their movies didn't have a guaranteed place to play, right? Getting distribution, you have a guaranteed way to distribute your product, and that is gone. The studio lots are not being used so much. And this is now, when Hollywood came about in the teens and 20s, this was orange groves and out in the country. Hollywood was way out of downtown LA. It was 10 miles outside of downtown. 10, 11, 12, and way out there in the San Fernando Valley and all that. Land was cheap. But LA grew. And all of a sudden now there are neighborhoods and offices and buildings and all that stuff. And so that means the taxes are going to go up, and it's going to be expensive to hold on to all this land. All this land is going to cost a lot of money, and at one point they're going to have to start selling it off. And partly it's expensive, and that's okay. You can justify it being expensive if it's being used, but with smaller cameras and more filmmakers are filming on location. You say, well, I don't want to look at fake Hollywood Paris. I want to go to real Paris or real New York. Okay, I don't want to keep doing fake. I don't know if you've seen the Austin Powers movies, but he made fun of this everything being shot in Hollywood. They were supposed to be in London, Austin Powers, and the camera sort of pulls back, and we see these typically brown Southern California hills just outside of London, and it's on purpose, and it's a funny joke. England is very green. Here's a Robin Hood movie, and it's these wonderful brown hillsides of Southern California. So that is the second part of the fall of the studio system. We also get actors getting out of their contracts. Income taxes were quite high at a certain rate. So if you made over $100,000 per year, which would be over $3 or $4 million per year, then the money that you made over $100,000 would be taxed at the 90% rate. And I bring this up because some people are talking about tax rates and tax structure. All taxes wouldn't be taxed at 90%. The first $10,000 or $20,000 would be taxed at 20%, and then it would be taxed at 30%, and so on. So today, when they're talking about a 50 or 60% rate, they're talking about money that is made over $1 million, not from the very first penny. So keep that in mind when people start talking about high tax rates. It's high taxes on the money that is made over maybe a couple $100,000 or $1 million or something like that. Anyway, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood is right there, right? That is who? Who is that? One of the biggest stars ever in Hollywood. Okay. Again, I'm just talking about fame. That is Clark Gable. He was in Gone with the Wind, and chances are you didn't know who he was. And again, it's not on you. It's how fame kind of goes away like the mists of time. And there he is with the biggest mogul. Louis B. Mayer, whose name is in Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. He's probably signing a contract for maybe Gone with the Wind. I think that's David O. Selznick. I bet that's Gone with the Wind. And so actors like Clark Gable, they're trying to not pay so many taxes. So they start getting agents. They start getting a piece of the action. Okay, they start getting a percentage of the gross, not just a salary. Not just, here we're going to pay you X thousands of dollars to make this movie, but you're going to get 1 or 2 or 3% of every dollar that the movie generates. That's going to start happening in the 1950s. And so most actors today, big actors like Leonardo DiCaprio, they're going to get a percentage of the profits. In the Avengers world, the Marvel world, Robert Downey Jr. was the only one that got part of the profits. And they had to go to the studio and ask for a lot of extra money to get him in Captain America Civil War, because he wasn't originally going to be in it. They wanted to put him in it, and he was going to cost them quite a bit more money than any of the other actors. So that's a good thing. And a big actress, Johnny Depp, has made hundreds of millions of dollars for the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. And all the big actors, Tom Hanks, Leo, they all generally are negotiated back-end deals, part of the contracts and stuff. And that is hurting the studio system, right? That's going to hurt the studio system. Big nail in the coffin is TV. And we'll put it at about 1950 or so. The studios had already dealt with radio. Mostly they kind of absorbed radio, and radio stars became movie stars, like Bob Hope and Bing Crosby and people like that. They kind of brought them into the movies. With TV, again, they didn't get it. They ignored it. They fought it. They told their big movie stars like Humphrey Bogart and Clark Gable, do not make television. Don't go on that television program. You're a big screen star. That is a little 21-inch thing, black and white, rabbit ears, all the whole rest of it. And they told their stars, do not go on TV, right? Because by the middle 1950s, maybe 40% or 50% of Americans had televisions, and it was starting to really hurt the movie industry. Finally, the late 50s, early 60s, they finally embraced it. Most television was live in New York, just like radio was. Television really came out of radio, not movies. And in the late 50s, television moved away from being live from New York and moved out more to California, where it was mostly filmed and sometimes in front of a live audience, but more filmed back then. I Love Lucy, things like that were filmed. But the movies lost a good 10 years of that. And they really, you have to wonder, why is it CBS and not MGM or not Paramount, right? Why didn't they found and run television? And they just were short-sighted. They just didn't get it. And the big business people, a lot of times they're short-sighted. The music industry really didn't get online and file sharing. They really never got streaming and Netflix. They've just always been kind of short-sighted. And as a really good example of all of that, when videotape came out, the studio response, the first studio response was to sue Sony, who made Betamax, and they sued him. They said, "You are stealing our copyrighted material," and they took him to court, and they lost. Okay, and you would think, gee, if people want to watch your movie on videotape, why don't you just record the movie at a nice high quality and package it up in a nice pretty color box with shrink wrap and sell it? But that wasn't their first thought. That wasn't their first thought. Their first thought was sue them. Okay? So again, they're not always very good at this whole forward-thinking thing here. That's a business thing. Okay, and their response was wide screens. And if we talk about aspect ratio, we see that this is fairly square, this slide here. This is kind of like a television screen or a movie screen, fairly square, right? And that is about 1.3 units by 1 unit, okay? But they started doing these widescreen movies that are 2.39 by 1, right? So these wide screens, and you might say, well, what's the big deal with this stupid wide screen? Well, the screen was actually bigger. In movie theaters, screens change size. And they change size because the curtains, they put a big giant screen behind the curtains, and the curtains open up to a certain width, and you watch the cartoons and all that in one aspect ratio. And then when the movie comes on in 1953, trying to lure the television audience into the theaters, the curtains would open and open and open and open, and oh my God, there's a giant screen back there. Look, it starts way over there and it ends way over there. So in a theater, this screen would be giant. It would start way off and keep going, right? And Cinerama had curved screens and 3 projectors and all that, right? So screens got really big. Now for us, our screens are fixed. Our television screens, our computer screens, our flat screens, everything is fixed. So the screen does not change size. And so they would have to put this wide movie, and they'd have to put black at the top and the bottom, or they'd have to just show the middle part of it, right? Remember that the whole thing is going to be this rather square aspect ratio. Okay, so you'd only be looking at the middle part, and the sides would get all lopped off. Now, for the most part, flat screen TVs have a wider aspect ratio. There's still a little bit of black. If it's a widescreen movie, there's a little bit of black. Most movies are in the middle at about 1.85. I don't want to throw too many numbers at you, 1.3, 1.8, and 2.4, but those are the aspect ratios. And that was the studio's response. And so today, most of our movies are in one of 2 aspect ratios, widescreen or sort of regular. And then if we're watching some old TV show like I Love Lucy, then we're going to see something square-ish. Or if we're watching an old-time movie like Casablanca, then we're seeing something in a rather square-ish look. Okay, so that brings us up pretty close, right? Pretty close into the 50s. Most of the stuff that we would be talking about in class, we've covered. And so now I can bandy about terms like studio system or first person and so on, or auteur, and you're going to know what I'm talking about. So all that stuff would have been in the first class. Now you're up. Now you're up on it, and we can talk about it moving forward. Our next class, we're going to talk about the 3 stages of the genre film. So we're going to go back a little bit for The Bride of Frankenstein, a wonderful, brilliant film from 1935. Then we're going to jump all the way up to The Shining from Stanley Kubrick in the 1980, and Young Frankenstein. So we're going to talk about the stages of the genre film, and then we're going to dive right into the French New Wave with Breathless and Blow Up and Fellini and some of that stuff. I know they're not American, but they are very influential on these young new American filmmakers. So we're going to touch very briefly on influences. And so after we talk about Mel Brooks and Stanley Kubrick, we're going to briefly get into Fellini and Kurosawa, and that will prepare us for the new Hollywood. Okay, so there we go. That's what a class is going to be like, only at this point there are film clips to look at. This class doesn't have film clips to look at, so you are done. But starting next class, there will be lots more links to films and things like that, including all those movies I just mentioned. All right, till next time, thank you so much. Take care. See you then.